Good morning, everybody. I figured that and happy Easter. I figured with the day, we would go to a little bit new environment. Of course, today is the day where we greet ourselves with He is risen. He is risen indeed. Um, this morning, our lesson is on the Third Commandment. The Third Commandment being, "Thou shalt not take the Lord thy God's name in vain." It's also translated probably more appropriately in the Hebrew as, "You shall not use the name of God wrongly," or "You shall not assign something to God's name wrongly." And I think that's probably why it's most apropos for Easter. Hopefully some of you will recognize my surroundings today. I know all of us wish we could be here for worship and be here to celebrate those events that we would normally be celebrating on this day. I think one thing that when I think about the Third Commandment, we often, and as I put out in one of my postings this week, we often think of it as, when have we used God's name in the form of a prerogative, or as we say around here in the South, when we've cussed. And certainly those are times in which we should be regretful and mournful. Bobby Joe, of course, thought I was a little bit crazy to post that, it's happened to me. It's happened to all of us probably from time to time. It's somewhat funny sometimes to think about when people say "gosh darn," because at the end of the day, we all know what we're thinking in our minds. And the fact that we might not use the literal idiom doesn't mean that we haven't actually committed the act itself, because at the end of the day, it's what's in our minds and maybe not what necessarily rolls off of our tongues. And so when I think about the Third Commandment, I really want to encourage you to think kind of the way that I do about this, and really the way that I have been taught and trained to think about the Ten Commandments, which is they're really all narrative, and they're all interconnected. One leads into the other, and it's not where we have 10 separate commandments that are unique. There's a rhythm to them, and there's a progression from one to the next. And that's one thing that I hope week to week, I give you some sense of what I see as the progression from one commandment to the next, and how the one that the one before builds on the next one, till we actually have almost a circular unity that we have at the end. The first two commandments, "I am the Lord your God," you shall have, you shall have no other gods before me, leads into, "You shall not make graven images." If there's no other gods before God, why then should you create images of God that you could potentially put before God? And then this commandment, "You shall not use God's name in vain, you shall not assign things to God's name," is meant really to take it a step further. If God is the only God, and there's no others before him, if you should not create images of God, or images that could potentially become false idols, then also the next step is you should not speak for God himself. Early on, the fact that we have historically seen this as a commandment to not cuss, or to not use God's name in idioms, really takes away some of the power and what I see as some of the authority of this commandment. Yes, certainly we don't want to use God's name in a pejorative way, or as idioms, or in our common language in a way that takes away from what God's name really is. But there's more to it than that. We have to really think about, what are we assigning to God? If you think about the early Jewish people and how, and even now, how they take the name of God, they take it very, with a lot of personal sacrilege. The Tetragrammaton, as what is the common referred to God's name in the Bible. It's written out in Hebrew, Yod, Hey, Wah, Hey. We generally read it as Christians as Yahweh. But when Jewish readers, especially those who are more conservative and traditional, when they come to that in the Bible, they replace it with Adonai, because you can't say the name of God, because they thought saying the name of God meant that you would use it in vain, that you would potentially be using it for your own purposes away from God's. And that's really something that we as Christians really probably need to begin to better understand. What does it mean to use God's name for purposes that are our own? Because that's really when we are using God's name in vain. That's when we really have used God's name in a way that takes away from his power and authority and his decision making. When we decide what God is doing, when we decide what God has said, when we decide what God is doing in this world, then we have actually taken away that authority from God, and we have used God's name in vain. And I think that's one thing that we as Christians, individually and as a community, have sometimes not talked enough about the proper use of God's name, about the proper use of his authority, and we can assign that. So as you progress through the different commandments, what God is trying to do is say, I am your God, there are no other gods before me, and only I, God, as God, can act and can show you what I decide to do and what I have the power to do. We as humanity don't have the right to do that. So we have to really be thoughtful about how we invoke God and how we invoke his authority. We have to think about, what has God done? God has created. God has given us the law. God has created a people first through the Jewish people, and then through Christ and the act of the cross and resurrection, he has saved. And then through the resurrection, he's given hope for eternal life. And so really, God himself has done all those things, and he has been the one that has done those acts. And those are the things that we really need to focus on. We have to think about how our discourse in daily life, how we might falsely be using God's name in vain. And this would probably be one where I would enter into sensitive territory, probably even more sensitive than when I confess that I've used God's name in vain in an idiom or pejorative way. We have to be careful about who we say God tells us to vote for. We have to be careful about who we say is an enemy of God. We have to be careful about who we say, what countries that we say that God has particularly blessed. When we read sing the hymns, God Bless America, we have to be careful to understand that that's as much a hope. That's as much us asking God to bless America. It's not saying that God has uniquely singled out America as his country. It's saying that we hope that God sees in our country a people that will be trying to bend themselves to God's way. It's not for us to assign ourselves God's people, because we can't do that. We individually have to act, have to find our way to God, and have to just decide to take that path. We have to be careful about how we talk about other people, how we identify our enemies. We can't say that an enemy of ours, as I said last week, is an enemy of God, because at the end of the day, God created the world. He created all of it, and through the message of Jesus, after his resurrection in Matthew 28, he says, go and make disciples. And it's probably most interesting that, what does he make sure to say in that? Go and make disciples in the name of. And he goes back to, I'm giving you that authority in my name. And we have to understand that act is done through us, but it's done in the name of God. And so, what can we say? As I said, God created people. God sent His Son. His Son lived with us. He healed. He taught. And then, as we have celebrated this past week, He was crucified and He was resurrected today. And that's what we can know that God has done. And God has done that in His name, and He has identified that, and He has marked all that out. And so now, really, the actions that are on us are to begin to go out and work based on those things that have been done in His name, and to make sure that we are doing acts that God would identify in His name. Not that we would identify in His name, but that God would identify in His name. I look around today, and as we are locked up and in our own home places, it's interesting to see all the different things that are popping up on social media, all the ways in which people are expressing themselves, are finding new ways to communicate with one another. It's a real challenge, and it's become an area in which we have to really think through how to communicate with one another and how to interact with one another in new ways. And I hope that while we may learn new things, we don't forget what we have already known over the last periods of our lives, but also hundreds of years, thousands of years, which is God meant for us to be together with Him, but also meant for us to be together as Christians in community. And that, as Jesus taught, as Paul taught once of the resurrection, that was the one thing that really was meant to be driven to us, which is we are to be in community with one another. We're to seek community with others who may not know of Christ's resurrection and the hope that it gives. I hope everybody's doing well. I'm sad that we're not able to enjoy sunrise this morning as we hope we would each and every year. But yet at the same time, in God's name we know, no matter whether we are together or apart, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Happy Easter, everybody.